Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. On August 23, 2025, the MacArthur Memorial hosted Finale in the Pacific, a half-day exploration of the end of the Pacific War. The event was a partnership between the MacArthur Memorial, the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, and the Military Aviation Museum. The following is one of the presentations from that event.
And now I have the honor to introduce our next speaker. Timothy J. Orr is the interim chair of the History Department at Old Dominion University here in Norfolk, Virginia. He received his bachelor's degree at Gettysburg College and his PhD at the Pennsylvania State University. He is the editor of Last to Leave the Field, The Life and Letters of First Sergeant Ambrose Henry Hayward, the author of the 3-volume Battle of Gettysburg series by Osprey Publishing, and the co-author of the national bestseller, Never Call Me a Hero, a legendary American dive bomber pilot remembers the Battle of Midway. His current book project is entitled No Routine Flights, U.S. Navy dive bomber pilot Donald Kirkpatrick Jr. and the Pacific War. And for 8 years, Dr. Orr has worked as a seasonal park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park. He has appeared on several television shows, including Who Do You Think You Are on the Learning Channel, Battle of Midway, The True Story on the Smithsonian Channel, The Greatest Events of World War II in Color on Netflix, and The Attack on Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute, also on Netflix. And he is also our museum's super secret weapon, as he has volunteered to write, research, or fact-check more museum publications and exhibits than I can count. His talk today is entitled Pilots Who Still Want to Shoot the Hell Out of Them, Navy Carrier Pilots and the Air Raids Against Japan, July 1st, August 15th, 1945. Please help me welcome Dr. Timothy Orr.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to go back by starting us off at a particular moment in time near the end of the war. At 12:45 p.m., August 15, 1945, what may have been the very last naval air-to-air action of the Pacific War occurred 200 miles southeast of Tokyo. 6 Japanese aircraft reached Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet. Although Emperor Hirohito had announced to his people that he would accept the surrender terms offered by the Allies, these pilots evidently did not get the message that the war was over. Cruising at 8,000 feet, they charged toward the American ships with intent to attack. Although Admiral Chester Nimitz had ordered all American forces to cease any further offensive action against mainland Japan, the Navy pilots who were in the air were more than willing to give these 6 enemy planes and their crews a warm reception. The Japanese pilots flew into the sector patrolled by VBF-86, a squadron of F-4U Corsairs attached to USS Wasp. One by one, Wasp planes brought them down. One of the American pilots who participated in this last dogfight was Lieutenant Commander Cleo J. Dobson of Coyle, Oklahoma. He was an interesting pilot, particularly because he had been involved in the very first aerial dogfight between Navy carrier planes and Japanese aircraft. Back on December 7th, 1941, as an ensign, Dobson had flown into Pearl Harbor during the midst of the Japanese attack. Not expecting to find enemy planes above the Pacific Fleet's primary base, the aviators of Dobson's squadron were taken by surprise and 5 of their planes shot down. Dobson lost a close friend in that dogfight, 26-year-old Ensign John Vogt Jr. of Julian, California, who was shot down near Eva Beach, Hawaii. Now you can bet that Vogt was on Dobson's mind when he attacked the Japanese aircraft 44 months later. Dobson's wingman sighted a D-4Y dive bomber, known by the Allies as Judy's, calling out, "Tally-ho, one bandit diving." From 25,000 feet, Dobson followed him into the dive. As he descended, he caught sight of the Judy and pressed the trigger on his guns. Dobson kept a journal of his activities, and his account of this action is quite instructive, as it does well to put modern audiences into the mindset of a typical U.S. carrier pilot at the end of the Pacific War. So here's what he had to say. "I closed in on his tail and really let him have it. His left wing root blazed and he went into a spin. After falling about 1,000 feet, his left wing came off and more flames came from his plane. We followed him on down and saw him splash in the drink. Boy, he really made a splash. That was my first shot at a Japanese fighter in the air, and I'll tell you, it was a thrill. I am satisfied the war is over now. That settles the score for Johnny Vogt, who got shot down on December 7th, 1941. We shot 22 Japanese down over the task group today. Maybe they are going to keep us in danger for a while. Well, we got lots of pilots who still want to shoot the hell out of them, and I am one of them. Written on the last day of combat action of World War II, the bloodthirstiness of Dobson's journal entry really stands out to me. I would argue that it offers a representative opinion of the Navy's view of itself during the last 46 days of the Pacific War. The fleet had been unceremoniously crushed at Pearl Harbor 3.5 years earlier, and through grit and leadership, it had managed to fight its way back from defeat, spearheading the advance across the Central Pacific. And now, at the war's final hour, the Navy wanted to establish itself as the final word, the final blow, the final act of vengeance in the Allied victory over Japan. But the ensuing years have not been kind to that memory. As the world entered into the atomic age, popular memory gravitated quite predictably toward the legacy of the atomic bombs and the destruction of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the dozens of Japanese cities felled by Curtis LeMay's firebombing missions of 1945. The destruction even had its own tagline, provided by 4,000-year-old Hindu scripture by way of J. Robert Oppenheimer: "I am become death, shatterer of worlds." I would never attempt to diminish the atomic bomb's importance, both in ending the war and in stirring debate about the ethics of war, but I would, however, confidently say that the mushroom clouds of August 6 and 9, 1945 have cast a long shadow that obscures the complexity of the final operations against Japan, to the point that certain missions have become utterly forgotten in the American imagination. And one of those missions is my subject today. The carrier launched air raids against the Japanese home islands. In terms of losses of planes and pilots, these raids were some of the most costly air missions of the Pacific War. Believe it or not, the Navy lost more aviators over Japan than it did at Midway, the most famous air battle of the Pacific. And it is a bit shocking that these missions are forgotten, as they involved a chorus of dangers: foul weather and fog, a hailstorm of anti-aircraft fire, furious dogfights above enemy territory, and perhaps not least of all, an American admiral obsessed with keeping these missions going up through the final hour. And most importantly, the air operations were strategically vital to the success of the invasion of the home islands, back when invading them was the only viable option the Allies possessed. Now, some of you might be dismissive of my subject, given that in the end, the air raids over Japan were not strategically necessary because no amphibious invasion occurred, but I encourage you not to think this way. We must remember that the people who lived in 1945 did not know how the Pacific War would end. The admirals who commanded the fleet and the pilots who flew the missions did not know the atomic bombs would or could end the war in one fell swoop. But they did know that the Army and Marine Corps intended to invade in November 1945, and in preparation for those landings, the Navy pilots put their lives on the line to make them possible. So as we take to the skies and try to imagine ourselves inside those cockpits, please take away these two important points. In the final hours, the violence of the Pacific's air war did not abate. And second, the carrier pilots did not observe the war's ending on the sidelines. They were in at the close. Now, the decision to attack the Japanese home islands with carrier planes originated from the mind of Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz viewed the air raids against Japan as a necessary step towards the implementation of Operation Olympic, the amphibious invasion of Kyushu, currently set for November the 1st. The U.S. fleet had recently ended its operations off Okinawa, an 82-day campaign that resulted in the loss of 9,700 sailors killed, wounded, or missing, the most costly operation the U.S. Navy had ever conducted. Knowing that the invasion of Kyushu would most likely result in another bloodbath, Nimitz insisted his carriers launch raids against the home islands to soften the enemy counterblow that would surely come during the invasion. The raids had two primary objectives. First and foremost, the need to demolish the Japanese air forces, which meant destroying Japanese aircraft in the air and on the ground. Second, they needed to sink the remaining Japanese ships. Now, although the Imperial Navy was no longer the unstoppable juggernaut it had once been, Nimitz believed that if the remaining Japanese battleships sallied forth during the Olympic landings, they could devastate the amphibious assault. Now, the role of attacking the airfields and ships fell to the U.S. Navy's Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey, an irascible but talented officer who harbored a burning hatred for the Japanese. In late June, Halsey and Nimitz met face-to-face, and as Halsey later explained, Nimitz gave him a broad directive. He wrote, "We would attack the enemy's home islands, destroy the remnants of his navy, merchant marine, and air power, and cripple his factories and communications. Our planes would strike inland, our big guns would bombard coastal targets. Together, they would literally bring the war home to the average Japanese citizen." Halsey assembled his ships, 102 altogether, at San Pedro Bay in the Philippines, and on July the 1st, they set out for mainland Japan. The most important element of Halsey's fleet was Task Force 38, under the command of 61-year-old Vice Admiral John Sidney McCain Sr. His force contained Third Fleet's carriers, 10 30,000-ton Essex-class fleet carriers, and 6 11,000-ton Independence-class light carriers. These were in turn distributed among 3 task groups, as indicated on my slide. 8 battleships, 18 cruisers, and 60 destroyers provided the escort. If you look carefully, you might notice that 1 task group is missing. 2 carriers had been badly damaged by kamikaze attacks off Okinawa, and another had its bow crumpled by a typhoon. But to fill that role, McCain acquired 4 British aircraft carriers and their escorts, which joined Task Force 38 on July the 20th. During the approach to Japan, Halsey's fleet enjoyed good fortune. Foul weather shielded the ships from the prying eyes of Japanese scout planes. The weather cleared on July the 10th, which was the exact day that Halsey needed to be cleared, and the carriers launched their airstrikes promptly that morning. The night before, the pilots huddled inside their ready rooms, going over intelligence reports and aerial reconnaissance photographs. The primary targets for the first 2 days would be the airfields surrounding Tokyo. The carrier pilots were far from the first men to attack Japan's capital. High-altitude Army Air Force bombers had been pounding this area for months, but they had been concentrating their efforts on the city proper and going at night, which forced them to leave the airfields untouched. The carrier pilots had planned to attack during the day, launching from about 150 miles offshore. The Navy planes would go in low, and which would assure them of better success in destroying the enemy aircraft on the ground. Now, the carriers launched about 1,600 sorties on this first day. Each carrier air group executed a series of strikes that lasted from dawn to mid-afternoon. Carriers of Task Force 38 deployed 4 different kinds of aircraft for these missions: fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter bombers. I'd like to run through them real quick just so you know what they look like. The squadrons of Grumman F-6F Hellcats handled the fighter sweeps and the combat air patrols. Hellcats were single-seat fighters, each equipped with 6 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the wings. And in a pinch, they could also carry small bombs and 5-inch rockets, but typically their primary purpose was air-to-air combat. The Essex-class carriers boasted squadrons of Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers, 2-person planes that dropped 2,000-pound bombs from their enclosed bays beneath the cockpit. These were precision weapons. They were dive bombers, which meant they attacked from a high altitude. They nosed over towards their target before releasing their bomb at 1,000 feet and then pulling out of their dive. Grumman TBM Avengers were the torpedo bombers. These were large 3-person planes crewed by a pilot, top turret gunner, and radio men who fired a ventral 30-caliber gun. And although they were called torpedo bombers, they rarely carried torpedoes during this stage of the war. More often, they carried an assortment of bombs in their bays. They could also deploy aerial mines, 350-pound depth bombs, or 5-inch rockets from rails under their wings. These were, in essence, the fleet's most versatile plane. Vought F-4U Corsairs constituted the fighter bomber squadrons. Much like the Hellcats, Corsairs were single-seat planes with 6 50-caliber machine guns, but they could also carry 4,000 pounds of ordnance and 8 5-inch rockets under the wings. They were not the best planes when it came to attacking enemy ships, but they were ideal for destroying parked aircraft on the ground. Now, throughout the month of July, McCain's carriers kept on the move. You'll see on the screen a complicated course tracking map taken from USS Lexington's after-action report, which will give you a good sense of all the at-sea maneuvers taken by the U.S. fleet. But to simplify that a little, McCain's pilots had concentrated their raids against 4 sectors in the month of July. The first phase of their attacks on July 10th and 11th involved raids against the Tokyo airfields. After that, 3rd Fleet turned north and the pilots commenced their raids against Hokkaido, where they targeted more airfields and also enemy industrial targets. After that, on July 18th, the pilots shifted their attention to the enemy naval base at Yokosuka. And finally, on July 24th, the 3rd Fleet attacked southern Honshu. And here, the pilots went after more airfields, but they also concentrated on the Japanese ships at Kure. Now, the initial strikes against the Tokyo airfields represented an unexpected cakewalk. The Japanese did not scramble many fighters, choosing instead to keep them hidden under camouflage or armored revetments in preparation for a possible land invasion. The Japanese generals believed their flyers would better serve the cause if they did not waste fuel, ammunition, or lives by frittering them away in dogfights against the American carrier pilots. So when the Americans approached on the first day of these raids, they found the skies relatively clear. But the attack against the airfields was anything but safe. When they reached their targets, the Navy pilots endured a ferocious hail of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese lined their beaches with heavy coastal guns, and machine gun batteries defended the airfields. When the Navy pilots reached them, they had to dive through thick puffs of flak as bright yellow tracers zipped up at them from below. But through this danger, the Navy pilots persevered, and their missions against the Tokyo airfields resulted in stunning success. Although they surely overestimated the damage they inflicted, the Navy pilots believed they destroyed 109 enemy aircraft on the ground and damaged another 231. Comparatively, American losses were much lighter. AA fire brought down 23 U.S. planes, killing 16 crewmen. Meanwhile, another 18 planes were lost operationally, meaning they crashed during normal flight procedures. And these disasters claimed the lives of 9 additional crewmen. Now, throughout the campaign against the Japanese home islands, operational losses happened often, brought on by a mixture of persistent bad weather, stress caused by prolonged flight operations, and relative inexperience of the new pilots. The graphic on the screen displays the aircraft and personnel losses sustained by USS Bennington's air group between July 3rd and August 14th. Bennington, incidentally, had the highest number of losses of any aircraft carrier air group during this campaign. During that time, it lost 44 aircraft and 25 aviators killed or missing in action. Of the various incidents that claimed these aircraft, 34% were operational losses. After a brief pause in operations, McCain's pilots attacked Hokkaido, focusing on an assortment of civilian targets: steel factories, railroad lines, rail ferries, coke ovens, fishing boats, marshalling yards, and coal collieries, structures that vitally aided the Japanese war effort. The Hokkaido strikes were much less successful, primarily because the weather refused to cooperate. The temperature dipped into the 60s, bringing with it wind, rain, and fog. These gray, overcast skies complicated takeoffs and recoveries, making it impossible for the air groups to coordinate. This hop produced navigators, not heroes, claimed the action report for USS Shangri-La. It continued. The takeoff was made in fog, the mission was executed in its fashion in the clouds, and the return to base was attributable to a few wings, prayer, and what navigation the pilots could marshal for the occasion. Admiral Halsey might have agreed, though he contended that little could be done about the weather other than to fly through it. Later in life, when he constructed his memoirs, he claimed he had to launch the missions because of pressure from his battleship commanders who demanded an opportunity to bombard the Japanese mainland. Halsey had tasked them with firing upon Muroran, an important coal and steel town, but they could not start the bombardment until the carrier pilots had swept the airfields that might be used as bases for kamikaze squadrons. The battleship strike had been set for July the 13th, but Halsey delayed it because of the fog. And when the fog failed to lift on July 14th, he sent the pilots in anyway. After the Hokkaido raids wrapped up, Halsey turned 3rd Fleet to the south in preparation for the assault against Yokosuka and Kure. High Command experienced some disagreement over this move, largely due to the fact that the Japanese ships no longer posed much of a threat. Photo reconnaissance suggested that the Japanese ships could no longer sail, and this was indeed true. Most of them had been without fuel since April. Further, few of them mounted any weapons. For instance, during the first week of June, the crew of Nagato, a 39,000-ton battleship anchored at Yokosuka, removed almost all of its AA guns, rangefinders, and searchlights, placing them atop Urayama Mountain. Only Nagato's primary and secondary batteries remained, but they could not be used except to fire upon ships that attempted to pass through the shipping channel. In essence, Nagato had become a floating battery, and the other ships at Kure had been likewise disarmed. Believing it a waste of manpower to attack unarmed ships, McCain suggested the pilots avoid both bases, but Halsey overruled him. He argued that if the enemy fleet survived the war, the Japanese would use it as an asset to secure more favorable terms at the peace talks. Now, it should be noted that Halsey offered this explanation after the war. At the time, his pilots sensed that he was simply bloodthirsty, and his stubbornness cost the fiery admiral some of his esteemed reputation. The Corsair pilot on USS Shangri-La noted in his diary, "Halsey is going wild on publicity, and we are all fed up to the teeth listening to all the crap he is putting out," unquote. Okay, once again, the pilots also planned to strike industrial targets in airfields, but these targets came with a strict prohibition. They were not allowed to attack Hiroshima or Nagasaki. These orders came from Nimitz himself, who had known about the atomic bomb's existence since early June. Halsey received his briefing about the bomb on July 22nd, when Rear Admiral William Purnell visited him on his flagship, reiterating that McCain's aviators must stay away from those cities. And of course, none of the pilots received any information on the bombs. All they knew was that these targets had been selected specially for the Army Air Force. This was, of course, a tricky proviso. Kure was only 15 miles south of Hiroshima, which meant that any pilot who ditched due to damage or engine trouble stood a good chance of landing in waters near that city. In fact, 3 American aviators were captured by the Japanese, held at a prisoner of war camp in Hiroshima, and were killed by the atomic bombing of August 6th. And near as I can tell, these were the only 3 U.S. sailors killed by that airstrike. Now, the attacks resumed on July the 18th with a large raid against the battleship Nagato. More than 100 Helldivers from USS Essex, Shangri-La, and Randolph pummeled it with their 1,000-pound bombs, followed by a wave of rocket-armed Hellcats from USS Bella Wood. AA fire proved intense, not simply because Nagato's AA guns had been put on a hillside, but Yokosuka housed Japan's best AA gunnery school, so the Empire's most well-trained gunners were present to man them. Now, a friend of mine, Radioman Bill Whitehurst, was involved in this attack, and I should point out, I know Bill because he was a professor in my department at Old Dominion University. He is 100 years old, and he lives 12 blocks in that direction. In 1945, he was 20 years old and a tunnel gunner in a TBM Avenger. That morning, his squadron made a glide bombing run against Nagato from 10,000 feet. And during the descent, his plane was hit by a 40-millimeter shell on the left wing. Now, fearing that he might not be able to pull out of his dive unless he jettisoned his bomb, Whitehurst's pilot released the payload early, and over the intercom, he asked Whitehurst to look out the window and see where the errant bomb had fallen. And Whitehurst cringed at what he saw. The bomb, a massive 1,200-pounder which had a delayed action fuse, had struck a nearby museum ship, the Mikasa, which had served as Admiral Hayachiro Togo's flagship during the 1905 Battle of Tsushima. Prior to the attack, the squadron skipper had warned everyone not to be fooled by the Mikasa because it wasn't a danger. And Whitehurst later wrote this. He said, "The Mikasa suffered a direct blow. For a 1904 ship, that was devastating. The Japanese could never understand why the Americans would want to bomb an old ship that was on land and refused to believe that it was a mistake." Now, 2 decades later, Bill, now Congressman Whitehurst, who represented this district, led the effort to restore the Mikasa to its former appearance. Now, overall, the July 18th mission was a success. The American pilots sunk Nagato, but it took a while to convince Halsey of that fact. Lieutenant J.G. Eugene Conklin, a Corsair pilot from USS Randolph, had the unfortunate task of snapping photographs. And I say unfortunate because upon returning, he could not convince any of the brass that Nagato had been sunk. After 3 successful attacks, all of Conklin's photographs depicted Nagato with its main deck still above the waves, which was as far down as the battleship could sink. Fearful he might not survive a 4th strike, he complained to the intelligence officers, "Tell the admiral that the battleship is already sunk. It is sitting on the bottom." Halsey's obsession with Nagato's destruction would not let him see the truth of the matter, and it took days to convince him that the ship had been sunk. Now, once Halsey accepted that Nagato was stuck in the mud, he set his sights on Kure. McCain's pilots launched 2 missions, one on July 24th, another on July 28th. Once again, the pilots had to brave their way through fairly intense AA fire to bring their ordnance to bear on the enemy ships. Now, one of the pilots involved in the July 24th raid was Lieutenant Harold Brem, a Helldiver pilot attached to VB-87. His target was the hybrid battleship Hyuga. A hybrid battleship is a battleship that has a stern-mounted flight deck, and you can kind of see it on that artistic rendition there. During his approach, Brem judged the anti-aircraft fire to be so intense that he decided to close his dive flaps and dive without them. This would increase the speed of his descent and make him harder to hit. But the trade-off was that without flaps deployed, he might not be able to pull out of his dive. His recollection is worth quoting. Now, for the first time, I got a good look at the target. The skipper had put us right on top of the Hyuga. We were diving about astern, but I could hardly see the ship. It was wreathed in a mass of smoke from all the guns firing at our diving planes. I could see gun muzzle flashes from every part of the ship and watch the tracers from the shells as they arced up. The heavier guns' projectiles looked like fiery red baseballs. I could swear that every one of them was headed directly at me. This is ridiculous, I thought to myself. That instant, I closed my dive flaps, deciding not only to dive clean, but to add throttle besides. Anything to get this dive over, to give the gunners as fast and as small a target as possible. Brem, by the way, did not make it back to his ship. His Helldiver took a flak burst in the left wing, and then during the return to his carrier, he became lost in a dense fog bank. After 7 hours in the air, he ended up ditching, and he and his gunner were eventually picked up by a destroyer, and that's how he survived. Incidentally, his squadron lost 6 of 11 planes during this mission. But Hyuga suffered much worse. It settled on the bottom, resting in waters a little deeper than those that claim Nagato, though it took 10 bomb strikes and 30 near misses to put it that way. More than 200 sailors who still manned the ship died in the attack. Altogether, the Japanese lost 28 ships sunk or damaged at Kure. If Halsey had intended for this mission to destroy completely the Imperial Combined Fleet, his pilots did not let him down. Now, the atomic bombings came 1 week after that. That news did not dramatically alter the mindset of most carrier pilots. When they learned that the bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, they reacted with a mixture of joy or indifference. A turret gunner on Yorktown wrote in his diary, "All hands are very much thrilled about it. It will shorten the war tremendously." Now, such unconcern for the milestone of atomic power might seem hard to understand, but it is important to realize that Navy pilots didn't get a chance to see the detonation of Fat Man or Little Boy. They were hundreds of miles away, and because they were flying missions constantly, they did not have the opportunity to contemplate the true meaning of the destruction of the 2 Japanese cities. Now, the spirits of the pilots buoyed on August the 10th when they learned that the Japanese had made contact with the Swiss government, saying that they intended to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. On USS Yorktown, the ship exploded in joy, holding a false celebration of sorts. The ship's flight surgeon dragged a tub of 180 proof alcohol and grape juice into the ready rooms, which led to an all-night bender. And my friend and colleague, Bill Whitehurst, was on the Yorktown. He awakened the next day to discover nearly all of his squadron's pilots passed out in the passageways or inside the ready room. "It looked like a mafia hit," he later told an interviewer. "These guys were on the floor, and this damn stuff, get this, had actually cut the paint on the deck. It was that bad." Up on the flight deck, Whitehurst discovered several pilots sitting in their cockpits, flight gear on, but passed out cold. Yorktown couldn't launch a single plane that day. Now, despite objections from McCain, who thought it wise to pause the flight operations until the U.S. State Department heard news from the Emperor, Halsey insisted that flight operations proceed on August 13th and 15th. So 2 more days of raids occurred, and contrary to popular belief, the atomic bombs were not the last bombs dropped on Japan. Carrier bombs were. So when the American pilots took to the air on August the 13th, many of them were not happy about it. They saw little of value in bombing Japanese positions merely to polish off a war that appeared all but over. VT-88 was part of a massive strike against the Shibaura Electric Company on the western shores of the Tokyo Bay. When they got there, they found the area socked in by fog. So the squadron rerouted to a fishing village that served as a haven for coastal patrol vessels. The TBMs carried huge 2,000-pound bombs, and Radioman Whitehurst feared that if they were dropped, they'd inflict senseless collateral damage upon the Japanese fishermen, many of whom were out on the water thinking that the war had ended. Whitehurst keyed his intercom, telling his pilot that the mission seemed foolish. Whitehurst recollected, "He cut me off, saying that we had our assigned target and would try to hit those small ships So that's where we were going. So over we went, and as I suspected, some of the bombs fell on the village, and heaven knows how many people we killed. Later on, Whitehurst, you can see him there, wrote about his feelings on the matter. He said, "The reader will wonder why I wanted to spare a fishing village, but was earlier willing to strafe farms. In retrospect, I know this was an inconsistency, since both were civilian targets, but I was 20 years old and simply made choices." I would hope that all of you should say to yourselves that it should not fall upon the shoulders of any of those 20-year-old gunners in any of those planes, or the 25-year-old pilots who were flying them, to contemplate the ethics of war. The decision to call off the raids fell squarely on the shoulders of the leaders, Admiral Halsey in particular. So while I might point out how the question of the atomic bomb's morality escaped the thoughts of most carrier pilots, I would also argue that the larger question of how ethics interfered with the arrival of peace did not. At war's end, these pilots contemplated the obligations they had towards their former adversaries. Thoughts of right and wrong were never far from their minds. Now, even after Emperor Hirohito went onto the radio to announce publicly his decision to accept the Allied terms of surrender, Halsey ordered the last scheduled air raid of August 15th to go forward. He had 3 strikes planned for that morning. 2 hours into the first flight, Admiral Nimitz, who monitored the situation from his headquarters in the Marianas, ordered a recall of all U.S. aircraft. Dutifully, Halsey got on the radio saying, "This is Christopher," his call sign. "The war is over. All planes return to base." But Halsey's orders arrived too late to recall Able 1, the first wave, which had already reached Japan, and some of the planes had already released their bombs. Thus, it churned up a swarm of enemy fighters who wanted to pay back the Americans for this very last hit. 20 Japanese fighters caught up with the division of 6 VF-88 Hellcats east of Atsugi Airfield, and this touched off the last major aerial dogfight of the war. In a few minutes, the Japanese shot down 4 Hellcats, killing all of their occupants: Lieutenant Howard Harrison, Ensign Wright Hobbs, Ensign Eugene Mandeberg, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Joe Saloff. The other 2 pilots who were with them, Lieutenants Junior Grade Ted Hansen and Maury Proctor, managed to fly clear of the area and land their bullet-riddled Hellcats back aboard USS Yorktown, telling the tale of their grief-filled final mission. As you might imagine, the loss of these 4 men dampened any celebration on that particular ship. Ensign John J. Willis bore the unenviable task of writing to the mother of Eugene Mandeberg, one of those who had been killed, and letting her know that his friend, her son, would not be coming home. Willis wrote this: "The world I know has lost a fine fellow and an intelligent compatriot. But as for myself, and as for the rest of my squadron mates, we have lost a friend. It's so difficult to express in writing what a man feels in his heart. I'm not capable of the fluency in writing that was one of your son's many accomplishments. My sincerest regrets to you, who have suffered so much. I'll close now with sorrow in my heart. Ensign John Willis, Fighting Squadron 88. Now, combat operations finally ended for good on the afternoon of August 15th, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, they likely ended with Cleo Dobson's takedown of a Japanese dive bomber at 12:45 p.m. Halsey's message to the fleet came about 15 minutes later, and it counseled vigilance. He said, "Now that the fighting has ended, there must be no letdown. There must be watchful waiting. Victory is not the end, but the beginning. We must establish peace, a firm, a just, and an enduring peace." Now, Halsey gave his pilots plenty to do. Nearly every day, they flew missions over the Japanese airfields. They had orders to take photographs so the U.S. Navy could catalog all the remaining enemy planes. Further, these images had to prove that the Japanese had disarmed and depropellered them. These missions surprised the Americans because they learned that the Japanese still had thousands of undamaged aircraft available. The American pilots also flew missions to locate prisoner of war camps so that during the occupation, those facilities could receive immediate medical assistance. Once located, the pilots parachuted food and supplies down to the Allied prisoners. And the Navy pilots reveled in these missions, and the fleet experienced no shortage of volunteers to fly them. Everyone wanted to be the one who broke the good news to the POWs that the war was over. The final curtain call were the aerial parades held by 3rd Fleet in the skies above Japan. Halsey held the first one on August 22nd, which was performed in very bad weather with 1 mile visibility. A pilot who participated in it wrote in his diary, "Planes were going every which way, dodging each other. Christ, I don't know how we keep from killing half of us. Luck or something, no fun at all. But more famously, Halsey ordered every plane that could limp into the sky to be part of the flyover of USS Missouri on September 2nd, when the Japanese delegation came aboard to sign the instrument of surrender. About 1,500 aircraft took to the skies, and even though they were marred by low overcast, they paraded over the battleship, as you can see here. For most squadrons, the mission took about 4 hours and involved countless circles, awaiting the arrival of every group before the order to parade past the battleship came. But what precisely did the carrier pilots accomplish during the last 6 weeks of the Pacific War? Well, certainly their operations were far from perfect. They struggled with the weather, and in the end, they never devised a solution to the rain and fog. Likewise, the carrier pilots never completed their mission of annihilating all the Japanese air forces, as the post-war reconnaissance photographs clearly proved that thousands of enemy planes had escaped destruction. But beyond those problems, the American carrier pilots achieved plenty of success. They dropped uncountable numbers of bombs. On August 13th alone, the pilots of Task Force 38 destroyed 422 Japanese planes. The two-day raid against Hokkaido led to the destruction of 44 ships, 96 small craft, and 94 locomotives. McCain's flyers practically saturated Japan's remaining wartime structures with ordnance. Overall, they made substantial progress in readying the home islands for an amphibious invasion. And in the end, the 6 weeks of raids cost Task Force 38 186 pilots and air crew, either killed or missing in action. While these losses were but a small drop in the bucket when placed within the context of the entirety of the Pacific War, they were in fact the largest single loss of life among American naval aviators for any operation. Larger than the Battle of the Coral Sea, larger than the Battle of Santa Cruz, and even larger than the Battle of Midway, where casualties among Navy and Marine Corps aviators numbered only 165. The last 46 days of the Pacific War proved to be some of the hardest for America's carrier pilots. For that reason, it baffles me that these missions are not more well known. I would argue that on this impending 80th anniversary of VJ Day, we should extend some gratitude to those men who put themselves into harm's way. We should remember them because they flew these final dangerous air missions of the Pacific War, and we should pay them the respect they so richly deserve. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.